Good evening, and thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to get started in just a few minutes as we give people a chance to sign on. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. We'll get started soon. Welcome everyone. Good evening. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds for tonight's event, Black Workers in Alabama on the Front Lines of History, from Hammer and Hoe to the Bamazon Union. We'll be starting shortly. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. We're so excited for you all to be joining us. Let me start by saying solidarity with Amazon workers, solidarity with Bessemer, Alabama, and Black Lives Matter. We're here tonight in solidarity with this historic union drive led by Black workers in the South, organizing themselves to fight low wages, unsafe work conditions, degrading and inhuman treatment by management, and the high-tech surveillance system that they're subjected to. There's this tremendous solidarity campaign supporting the Bessemer workers and organizers and the RWDSU, and Support Alabama Amazon Workers campaign is launched a campaign of solidarity, and so many different groups from across the country and indeed across the world have signed on in solidarity with this tremendously important and historic union drive. These workers really are pushing the struggle forward for our entire class, and their effort demands our solidarity. My name is Ted Kelley with the Support Alabama Amazon Workers campaign, and I am so honored to be here tonight with Asantwa Nkrumah Toure, who I would love for you to introduce yourself right now, comrade. And just, comrade, remember to unmute.
All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Ted, my dear comrade, Ted Kelley. Good evening, everyone. My name is Asantwa Nkrumah Toure. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a member of Black Alliance for Peace and the Green Party of Philadelphia. I'll be co-facilitating this conversation this evening with my comrade, Ted Kelley. We thank you all so very, very much for joining with us for this very exciting and very timely conversation with Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley. We also want to thank Dr. Kelley for his time in joining with us for this conversation. And also, if I may add, Dr. Kelley, happy revolutionary birthday to you. I know your birthday was this past Sunday, March 14th. So again, we wish you happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
So moving along, Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley is a historian, renowned scholar, activist, and just does all kinds of great things. He is the Gary B. Nash Professor of American History at UCLA. He is the author of several books, one of which is the one we'll be discussing this evening, Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression. Some of his other books include Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class, Yo Mama's Dysfunctional, Fighting the Culture Wars in Urban America, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, Three Strikes, Miners, Musicians, Sales Girls, and the Fighting Spirit of Labor's Last Century, written also with Howard Zinn and Dana Frank, and the award-winning book, Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original. This book won several awards, including the Best Book on Jazz Award from the Jazz Journalists Association. So everyone, if you would please join me in welcoming Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome, Dr. Kelley. It's really a pleasure for you to join us. Asanta, would you like to ask your first question? And then maybe
Sure.
that can be a way that we can prompt Dr. Kelley to speak for the first part of this program.
Sure. Dr. Kelley, again, thank you very much. Dr. Kelley, Hammer and Hoe was first published in 1990, 31 years ago. And I first read it in 2017. And I really enjoyed reading about the organizing of the communists, the CPUSA in Bessemer, Alabama, and Birmingham, Alabama, and other parts of the South during the Depression. I noticed they faced a lot of great challenges. They were organizing workers, Black workers, sharecroppers, the unemployed, launching campaigns against different forms of racism, and even their victories. We look today at the exciting situation today in Bessemer, Alabama, and the Amazon workers now voting to join a union, Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, RWDSU. Can you please give us an overview of this period of time and some lessons we can learn that will aid in our political work today? Dr. Kelley.
Yes, of course. Before I say anything, I just have to thank you, Asanta, for all the work that you do, for just being such a pioneer and revolutionary, and also just for everyone who organized this event, because it's really important. This, to me, this struggle right now in Bessemer is, in my view, like equivalent to the strike of 250 Indian workers that we witnessed, just really ongoing in terms of its historical significance. And I want to sort of shout that out, but also shout out Black Alliance for Peace, which is one of the great organizations that I support and follow, because in part, because, you know, it's an organization that pays attention to the world, which we have to do right now for various reasons. So let me just begin with the obvious, you know, why it's important to know the history of Alabama. I mean, part of it, you know, we miscalculate the South all the time. We sometimes think of it as a place of backwardness, of white racism, as if white racism isn't everywhere. And I'll give you an example. Like we think of Selma, and recently we had sort of the anniversary of a Bloody Sunday, and our image of Selma is one of Black people being beat by state troopers trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. What we don't see is the fact that Selma had a communist party, Black communists there, in places like, you know, Dallas and Lowndes County, and in Selma proper, where armed Black men and women formed the Sharecroppers Union and waged a strike in 1935 and fought with guns, faced bloody attacks from police and vigilantes, and on some of these plantations actually won the demand for $1 a day to chop cotton. We just don't pay attention to the long history of working class struggles in the South, Black working class struggles, multiracial working class struggles in the South. Alabama has a history going back, United Mine Workers in the 1890s, you know, before that, the Knights of Labor. And you know, when you look at the history of labor, you know, Black workers had been at the forefront of organized labor. You know, right around World War I, during all these insurgencies that took place, not just in the North, in Chicago and Washington, D.C., but in the South, in Arkansas and in Alabama. During those insurgencies, you have a kind of lull. After these insurgencies are crushed, you have kind of a lull in organized labor. But when organized labor began to resurge again, Black workers were at the forefront. In the South, Alabama was at the forefront. So when I wrote Hammer and Hoe 30 plus years ago, you know, it was a book primarily about the Communist Party and secondarily about the labor movement, but in some ways they're inseparable. Without the Communist Party, there would be no labor movement in Alabama in the 1930s. So the CP, alongside many of the organizations that helped spawn, like the Southern Negro Youth Congress, the International Labor Defense, the Sharecroppers Union, which had a membership of about 12,000 at its height, the National Negro Congress. All these were factors in building the Black working class movement. And you got to realize that for the 30s and 40s, the party was central. For the 60s, it was the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights as a main factor. For the 70s, it was the Jefferson County Welfare Rights Organization, the Alabama Economic Action Committee, the Southern Organized Committee for Economic Justice, and the Alabama Black Liberation Front. These are all critical to working class struggles in the 70s. So what do I mean by that? What I want to just suggest here is that trade unions don't succeed just because people are broke or because they're hungry or because they're mistreated. Their success depends on organizers, and organizers who have a vision of social justice that's bigger than the plant, that's bigger than the warehouse. And this is exactly what RWDSU brings, that kind of broader vision. And successful union struggles depend on a community strategy, on solidarity from people who don't work in the plant, who don't work in a warehouse. And we see this happening now with solidarity statements around in actions around the world in support of the Amazon workers. We saw with Black Lives Matter organizing a 100-car caravan in Bessemer, just, I think it was Sunday, in support of their campaign. And we see this in your upcoming action on March 20th in support of this campaign. So, in a nutshell, think about what the book really tries to do in terms of its lessons. People join the Communist Party not out of some economic calculation or narrow interest group politics. They joined because they were fighting for something greater than themselves. They were fighting for each other. They were fighting for a fairer, less oppressive world. So that's why when I, go back and look at Hammer and Hoe, and I look at RWDSU, I look at one of the unions that really owed its foundation to the CP, and that's the International Mine Mill and Smelter Workers Union, which was based in Bessemer, formed in 1933. Like RWDSU, they were also up against a behemoth. In this case, Amazon, in their case, Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, which was once a subsidiary of Carnegie, and their police, company police used violence and intimidation to try to crush the union. And they also used race to try to divide up workers. And they didn't succeed fully, but they came close. And the reason they didn't succeed was because Mine Mill had that larger social justice vision. They fought issues around racism beyond the workplace. They, continue to, they fought the company unions, which is another thing that we have to pay attention to. In those days, the way that companies would undermine unions would be to introduce company unions. In the case of Alabama, it was first a union called the ERP, which stands for employment, what is it called again? Employment, it's been so long since I thought about this. ERP, basically employment plan. It's like, a plan between employers and workers, supposedly, but it's not really a union at all. So ERP was the first one. And then there was the Brotherhood of Captive Miners, which was another one. So the idea was that they would use these company unions to undermine the legitimate unions. And those unions use race to draw out the white workers to say, look, this is a union full of Black people. They use the N-word. And if you don't join this union, they're gonna marry your daughter. I mean, this is the kind of stuff they would make up, right? So that was one factor. But the other thing which I want to really emphasize is that in the 1930s, and this is where we make a comparison with today, the 30s is considered, especially the 30s under Roosevelt, the best period for labor, the friendliest period for labor. This is a period of the New Deal, right? This is a period when the Congress passed the National Industrial Recovery Act, which had a provision that said that, you know, workers had a right to unionize. I mean, we take that for granted today, but that was a huge deal. The Supreme Court struck that provision down, Section 7A, and then Congress came back with the Wagner Act in 1935, which did all kinds of things to support labor. It made closed shops legal, that is to say, places of work where you were required to pay union dues to keep the job. That's called a closed shop. That was legal now. They outlawed most unfair practices by employers, and they created the National Labor Relations Board, which is used to mediate disputes. Now, why is this important? Because despite all that, despite this being like the best period for labor, it was a bloody struggle. I mean, cities passed anti-sedition ordinances like in Birmingham and Bessemer, which were intended to crush any kind of militant labor organizing, crush any civil disobedience, and crush the union. You know, company unions were allowed to exist precisely because of the federal government's provision saying that unions are illegal. That's how they got around it. And so a lot of people were hurt and killed in an effort to build a union movement under the best of conditions. So as we enter this Biden era, and just because, you know, President Biden does say, look, he supports the union, that's great. Look, who's gonna like disavow that? But that doesn't mean that everything's hunky-dory. You know, it just means that the same conditions that we witnessed under the best conditions for labor, which still led to these bloody struggles, are with us today, which is why solidarity is all the more important. And one last thing I just want to say about this period is that because Mine Mill was a left union, left identified union, during the Cold War, the CIO leadership, which had bought the kind of Cold War ideology, kicked them out of the CIO in 1949 because they refused to accept a loyalty, you know, forcing all their members to take a loyalty oath because they refused to be anti-communist. And that opened the door for union leaders who were less likely to support social justice, racial equality, the end of kind of racialized ceilings for job mobility for Black workers. In other words, the more reactionary figures in labor movement prevailed, and the more radical figures like Asbury Howard and others of Mine Mill struggled, but still prevailed. But they still had to struggle against these kinds of forces. So there's, I mean, that's just in a nutshell, like a few of the key lessons we can take from Hammer and Hoe and from that period. But I also don't want to suggest that we need to always go back to the 30s, because there's a history even after that period that impinges on the current struggle in Bessemer.
Thank you, Dr. Kelley. It's such an important history, and you're right. We have a lot of lessons to learn from it, and from the subsequent periods as well. I'm going to make just a couple announcements, but before I do, I also want to say that tonight we're also going to be joined by the legendary organizer Saladin Muhammad, who is one of the key organizers, the key organizer of the Southern Workers Assembly. We're going to be hearing from him a little bit later on, but I just wanted to give a shout out to Saladin Muhammad. And also, just as a reminder to everybody who's listening right now and watching, the chat and the Q&A are open for questions. We're going to have some time towards the end of this program for Dr. Kelley and Saladin and Asantwa, I'm sure as well, to answer some questions. You know, one of the things that for me was so clear in reading Hammer and Hoe is that the history of Black workers in the United States is the history of leading really the working class struggle for the entire class, even when other sectors of the working class have been less developed. And we know that a major part of why Bessemer workers are organizing today is because of these tremendous uprisings against police terror that took place last summer. This mass movement helped encourage workers to organize, and it was a mass movement of workers against racism. Um, in your book, Dr. Kelley, there are many instances of police brutality and white mob violence against Black people at that time, against labor union organizing and other radicals. You know, I'm struck in particular by the anecdotes of Black farmers who were shot or beaten, who walked, in one case, 17 miles to the hospital, only to be turned over to the cops to die from medical neglect in jail. And it just, I mean, I could not think of our brother and comrade Mumia Abu Jamal, who was, after suffering from COVID-19 and from contracting hepatitis C and the complications there, this is what the state is trying to do to him right now as well. So I wonder, given all this, you know, how are the conditions similar? How are they different to what Black workers in Alabama face today?
Right, right. Yeah, if anyone ever says that fascism doesn't exist in the United States, there's a long list, so there's a lot of evidence, but actual existing fascism is not just medical experimentation, but using cages to lock people up and deny them basic medical attention. And this is happening to Mumia, this is happening to Mutulu Shakur. There's a long list of this kind of thing. And, you know, to go back to the story from Hammer and Hoe, the story you mentioned was during the early period of the Sharecroppers Union, when it was a man named Clifford James who was involved in a shootout with police, with the sheriff in Tallapoosa County, Alabama. And it's important to realize that he went really far to a hospital to get help because he thought he was getting help from Black doctors at Tuskegee. And instead, he got turned over to the police. And then this is part of the story as well, that the whole state apparatus cannot exist without the support of what they used to call back in the day, like turncoats, you know, basically a strata of the Black elite or paid agents within the state who participate and maintain the state's power over people when they're fighting back. And it makes them really vulnerable. So if you can't go, so I mean, that's why he went so far. If you can't go to Tuskegee for medical attention, and you think it's a safe space, then where can you go? You know, and so that's really important. The other part of the story is to tie it to Black Lives Matter in the movement or movements, I should say, is that, you know, almost every action, even labor action within Alabama in this period, had some relationship to, you know, some cases of police brutality or struggles around criminal justice. So Bessemer, for example, some of the workers in Bessemer, one in particular I write about, was falsely accused of raping a white woman. And it was very clear it never happened. And it was the International Labor Defense that defended him, you know, to both, you know, in the courts, but also in the streets. You know, there were all these cases of police violence in Birmingham and Bessemer, people being shot and killed. Many of them were steel workers, were iron ore workers, and their most important defense were members of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, for example. You know, people like Eb Cox and Matt Code and Esther Cooper Jackson and James Jackson, Dorothy Burnham, Louis Burnham, Ed and Augusta Strong. They were in the streets organizing against police violence as they were organizing and supporting workers. And so the relationship between these are very, very important. And even if we move forward into the 60s and 70s, some of the organizations I mentioned, like the Alabama Black Liberation Front, and as well as the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, they were all fighting police brutality, police violence. Police violence was central, and it was a catalyst for so many movements, vigilante violence as well. I mean, we all know that in terms of the kind of swelling of the civil rights movement as a movement, the formation of SNCC and so many of these organizations, that the catalyst was not Brown v. Board of Education or the hope for integration at all. It was the murder of Emmett Till, you know? And you see the same thing specifically in Alabama, where young people are being killed and beaten by police. And that's enough for people to join organizations and link those organizations against police violence to the labor movement. And Asbury Howard, who's that's a name that everyone should know. Asbury Howard, one of the leaders of the International Mine Mill and Smelter Workers Union, and was a kind of bridge between the civil rights movement of the 60s and the struggles in the 40s and 50s. He, fought on every front, including struggles against state violence. He was incredibly important. And not to like complicate matters, one of the reasons why his union kind of lost its status was because it was investigated by a man named Herbert Hill, who on behalf of the NAACP went down there, investigated Mine Mill and said, these are a bunch of communists, we need to do something about them. So the NAACP played a very treacherous role. I'm not saying they're playing that role today, but played a very treacherous role in undermining the kind of progressive or radical formations that were fighting on all these fronts against police violence, against a racist criminal justice system, and for the rights of workers to be able to earn a living wage and survive, and be able to rise up within the ranks of their jobs. So there's a lot of history here that resonates with what we've seen just over the last year.
Dr. Kelley, I noticed now that you actually have Mumia's book right behind you, Have Black Lives Ever Mattered, a wonderful, wonderful collection of essays.
Yes, I have all of Mumia's books, all of them, every single one.
Asanto, I was wondering, I feel like this is a perfect segue for your next question.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Dr. Kelley, thank you for that response. You touched on my next comment. I was amazed from reading your book. I was amazed that there were instances where the NAACP and other Black leaders were indifferent or hostile to the efforts of the communist and or the labor union organizers. And it reminds me of what we see sometimes today, particularly in the past few years, in the era of Black Lives Matter. Certain members of what I call the civil rights industrial complex were indifferent, if not hostile, toward the more militant, anti-capitalist members of Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Some of these folks, as why aren't these young people in church? And look at all these gay and lesbians, and look at all these transgender people, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can you speak a little bit more about that in terms of what I see is young people, particularly in Black Lives Matter, but in other organizational formations, are forcing us to really think about how to be more visionary and more fair about liberation, about Black liberation. So can you expand a little bit more on that?
Right. That's an excellent question. And I would even go back. I mean, what we saw, the culmination of which we saw during Black Spring 2020, but you can go back. You can go back and see elements of it in Cincinnati in 2001. You could especially see elements of this broad-based visionary kind of politics, anti-capitalist and queer politics in Ferguson. Ferguson was like the turning point, I would argue, in terms of really presenting an alternative to kind of an old school civil rights. And what's important about Ferguson is that, because I was in the room with some of our most amazing organizers, it wasn't generational, because some of the folks who came out of SNCC and stuff, they were in the room with these young people, with them shoulder to shoulder. I mean, I just saw amazing organizers from definitely, and certainly Organization for Black Struggle, Jamala Rogers, all of them, they were sort of shoulder to shoulder in the same space, fighting for a new anti-capitalist kind of visionary politics. And they pushed back against the more traditional civil rights leadership that felt like, getting endorsements, corporate endorsements, and being respectable was the path forward. And I think that in terms of what happened over the last year, and again, I'm going to connect it back to Alabama in a second, but what happened over the last year, for those people who maintain a kind of radical politics, who maintain an anti-capitalist vision, who were part of the effort on the part of Movement for Black Lives to really build a politics that was not necessarily tied to or locked into the Democratic Party. When you look at that, those are the people who are not surprised by the sort of attack on the Capitol, by the sudden withdrawal of all these people who said Black Lives Matter, the Petco, Target, Cadillac. I mean, all these corporations that were really quick to put out these beautiful commercials to make us feel good that we're Black and we're different, and even that we're queer, like the Cadillac commercial. All these corporate figures have no opposition. I mean, they're trying to basically buy our communities. And because these are companies that are not doing anything in terms of their workers, in terms of benefits for people who work for Target, for Cadillac, for Petco, for, certainly for Amazon, and these are the same people that weren't, it's kind of radical anti-capitalist, visionaries that emerged out of this movement that were not willing to say, let's just set aside our demands to defund the police for abolition, because we desperately need to get Biden elected. And I'm not saying that the struggle to sort of remove Trump wasn't important. Of course it was important. No one's going to deny that. But the idea that you kind of sell your politics in order to make that happen, that was a real big struggle. And so to jump back to the 1930s, one of the consequences of the attacks on the left was that by the time you get to the civil rights insurgencies of the 1960s in Alabama, with Fred Shuttlesworth, who was heroic and brave and powerful, who also played a role in Cincinnati when he moved up there. But basically, much of the radical economic justice platform that was part of the Communist Party and Mine Mill and all this in Southern Negro Youth Congress, though that part of the platform got pushed out in favor of desegregation. And then as we move forward, police violence was still not addressed. And it's not an accident that, Richard Arrington, the first Black mayor of Birmingham, was elected not because he had Walmart behind him, not because he had kind of corporate sponsorship. He was elected because Black people were pissed because the police were killing them. Police brutality was a thing that mobilized support for Richard Arrington, no matter what his politics might have been in the end. So these are really important lessons for why we cannot set aside a kind of liberation politics or justice politics and anti-capitalist politics and vision for the sake of following and maintaining the power of the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party is not our party, And Fannie Lou Hamer taught us that. I mean, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party taught us that. We know this. And so this is like a real important turning point, I think, for everyone. And so we just can't get caught up in thinking, well, now that our people are in the White House, oh, this is going to be an easy one. The Amazon workers are going to get their raise, and we're not going to bomb Syria, or we're not going to, wage war on China. I mean, that stuff's not going to happen because our people are in. That's not the case.
It's so important that you mentioned that too. How many corporations and politicians and corporate politicians will say Black Lives Matter, but they don't support a living wage, for Black people. It brings to mind
Exactly.
what a comrade here in Philly who was fired for organizing at Whole Foods, Comrade Megan Murray, said that, you know, they'll call us heroes, but they won't give us hazard pay.
Right.
You know?
Right. By the
So
way, could I just
yeah,
mention something really funny I totally forgot to mention, which is actually relevant to this question of how corporations work. Just a small little anecdote. Someone sent me an email saying that they tried to get a review of Hammer and Hoe onto the Amazon website, right? Onto their website. And the review was, people need to read this book in order to support the Amazon workers. And they would not, they blocked it. Amazon said, you cannot publish this review. And that tells you everything. That tells you everything. I mean, we these corporations, they don't love us. And they are able to reproduce themselves and make money and continue to get support because they pretend to. And we're too quick to kind of go for the okey doke, as Barack used to say. You know, we just can't do that. These are dangerous times, and there's not a corporation that's going to love us back, including the university.
yes, the academia as well is another one of these institutions in this capitalist white supremacist system. That's super important. I just want to say that, you know, one of the reasons that we're having this event, and one of the reasons we're so grateful for Dr. Kelley to be on with us, is that we're building for another historic day of solidarity with Bessemer workers. In February, on February 20th, over 50 cities mobilized in solidarity with Bessemer workers across the United States. These mobilizations had a big impact in growing solidarity. And it's no surprise that President Biden gave his support to Bessemer workers after these actions took place, like Dr. Kelley was just saying. And, you know, we're going to continue to build. Over 40 cities are already planning to hold actions on March 20th, which everyone should check out at supportamazonworkers.org. That's where you can learn more. If you see that there's no action taking place in your city, it is not too late to organize one. Even if it's just 5 people picketing in front of a Whole Foods or another Amazon-owned location, that's going to show the workers in Bessemer, Alabama, that there is really dedicated solidarity out there. Showing your solidarity with workers organizing in the South in particular, it is the duty of revolutionaries. We also want to mention that this struggle is an international struggle. On March 22nd, 8,000 Italian workers are going to go on strike at Amazon. Solidarity messages to actions in Bessemer have been sent by workers all over the world. This is what they need. So special thanks to Dr. Kelley for endorsing these important solidarity actions, and also for raising up the strike of 250 million Indian farmers, leading what might be the largest labor strike in human history. It's fascinating, Dr. Kelley, that you mentioned the review being censored on Amazon. I know there was a book called, it's like an anthology essay collection called Capitalism on a Ventilator, that a bunch of different people contributed to, from Ajamu Baraka, Black Alliance for Peace, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Lee Soo-hin, all these social justice activists and organizers and writers wrote this book about how capitalism has failed during COVID-19 and how the People's China actually did a pretty good job of dealing with it. Amazon refused to sell it on their website. There was actually a big campaign to get them to list it, and finally, after months and months, they actually made it available for sale on there. I mentioned that because reading Hammer and Hoe, there's a particular form of racist testimony that was leveled against Angelo Herndon and Frank Burns in Birmingham, and it actually, like, I think it was a Klan member, but it was multiple people, implied that they were Chinese or half Chinese. And this fear of foreign-born communists stuck out to me, in particular, rereading in 2021, when there's been this tremendous tide of really horrible xenophobic violence and paranoia. So I mentioned that to say, what are the lessons from this history, and how is international solidarity a way of fighting white supremacy?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question. By the way, I don't encourage people to buy my book from Amazon. When this person wrote me, I said, I said, it's kind of funny, but I said, but I'm not trying to promote my book on Amazon. I'm like, look, just for the 423 people on here, if you look hard enough, you can find a free PDF copy of my book.
Yes.
It may not have the new introduction, but you can always find that. You can read that through Google Books, but don't spend money. I mean, I have all of Mumia's books. I don't need anything else, so I'm just saying, just don't buy from Amazon, because if we could cut them off as consumers, given the fact that Jeff Bezos made $100 billion during the pandemic, I mean, really, we just didn't give them money anyway. So to go back to the question, it's a great question, and reminded me of that testimony where Angela Herndon and Frank Burns they claimed that they used Frank Burns in particular used a Chinese name, and it's kind of an amazing sort of claim, given the fact that in the 1930s, this is 1930 itself actually, China hadn't gone communist yet, but still the idea of the foreign born was always, this kind of xenophobia always used as an excuse to explain worker rebellion, especially Black worker rebellion, because everyone knows Black workers are just happy. They were happy as slaves. In fact, they're so sad. The only reason they're sad now because they're not slaves anymore. I mean, that was the mythology circulating, right? And so they would have to be activated by someone from the outside, and not even an American. They would have to be some kind of foreign-born object. And keep in mind that just, in the decade before that, in the 30s, so many of the anti-sedition laws that were passed were tied to anti-immigration laws. The anti-Italian, the idea that Italians were anarchists, the idea that communists were, foreign-born Jews. I mean, this was the kind of assumptions, and even the development of border policing on the southern border during the Mexican Revolution. That was about revolution. That wasn't about like competing jobs. That was about the threat of a revolution on the border of the United States that could come, fighting for social democracy and socialism, that could actually cross the border and impact working class people in the United States. So that's like the oldest trick in the book, the use of xenophobia. And it's having impact today, of course, because, I mean, imagine, I heard my dear friend Vijay Prashad this morning on Democracy Now! Talking about China and the war on China. And I would, without repeating anything he says, I would just suggest everyone go back and listen to that interview with Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez, because it's a great interview that lays out, the impact that this kind of xenophobia is having in terms of silencing China's role in not just eliminating forms of poverty, but also in terms of the vaccine wars that are going on. And ultimately, it shrouds the fact that that this administration supports big pharma in its protection of patents so that other countries can not reproduce the vaccine. I mean, this is how bad capitalism is. If you think capitalism has some good qualities, well, this is like an example of how it operates. And so and that's why, it's inseparable. The xenophobia is inseparable from the sort of the way in which capitalism is reproduced. They go together, and that's why the same figures in the administration under Trump could say, well, we need to defend the Uyghurs because they're Muslims, as they drop bombs on Afghanistan. I mean, I'm not defending anyone, but just simply laying it out as it is. And I think this is really important. Now, one last thing I'll just say about xenophobia, sometimes it backfires. And one of the things I learned writing Hammer and Hoe, and this is not so much xenophobia, but it's about the idea of the outsider, is that part of what made the party so successful, why so many Black people embraced the Communist Party, was that when they heard about it, they figured out two things. One, the white people called them Yankees, and their recollection was that the Yankees were on the right side of Reconstruction. So therefore, they must be our friends. So the Yankees, Yankee communists, well, yeah, of course, come on in, I'll feed you, let's build a movement. The other thing is that international solidarity was something that even living in rural Alabama, people really paid attention to. So if the person who runs a plantation on which you work, who runs a plant, treats you like dirt, and you find out that across the ocean, there's a place called the Soviet Union, where there's this cat named Stalin, who, if things get bad, he's going to send ships. I actually I interviewed someone named Lemon Johnson, who I remember sitting in his ramshackle house in Lowndes County, Alabama, and he's telling me the story. In fact, let me just share the story because it's actually worth it. He's telling me the story about, how they won the cotton picker strike in 1935. And the first thing he says, well, let me tell you how we won. He says, so he opens up his drawer and he pulls out of his drawer two things. He has a box of shotgun shells, puts it on his bed. Then he takes out a copy of Lenin's What Is to Be Done, puts it next to the shotgun shells, and he says, theory and practice. Theory and practice.
Hell yes.
And then he said to me, he said, look, we weren't afraid of the planters because we knew that if anything were to go down, if they would try to kill us, that Stalin would send ships across the Atlantic into Mobile, and he would send 7 ships, and each ship would have these troops, and 7 men with weapons would show up and protect us. Because of course, the number 7 is a magic number in many ways. So this is how he thought. That's international solidarity,
Yes.
right? I mean, my mind was blown, but then it made perfect sense because, again, you can't trust the United States if you live in Alabama, but you can trust these other people because they say, even if you can't actually trust them, they say they're for solidarity with you, they're against racism, they're for socialism, they're for something else. And that's where xenophobia actually backfires because the foreign suddenly become your comrades.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful. To everyone, we're going to be hearing from our brother Saladin in just a moment, but 2 quick comments I'd like to make. Dr. Kelley, from reading your book and other books, what I've noticed is that in many instances, not all, but in many instances where there are Black people who are communists or have communist socialist politics, some of them are also active in their churches.
Yes.
So that is to say that you being a communist or socialist does not require you to be atheist or not be active in your place of worship. And I think that myth needs to be permanently destroyed among people of African descent. Right. Because we still have people who go around here even today in 2021 to talk about, well, they don't like church, they don't like Jesus, etc. And that's not the case, particularly if you've done a careful reading of the Bible, the New Testament, I'm speaking of specifically, and any type of communist or socialist literature. They're very complementary. But there was one question in the chat that I can't let go by. And someone who is dear to my heart and very inspirational to me is Mama Esther Cooper Jackson.
Oh my goodness.
And women in this movement for the time period that you're talking about. So if you could talk a little bit about who I call Mama Esther Cooper Jackson, and then we'll be hearing from Brother Saladin Muhammad.
Right. Well, Esther Cooper Jackson and Dorothy Burnham, 2 astounding women. And I've been fortunate to spend time with both, especially Esther, who was the most generous person. She, you can read about, I mean, I write about her in my book. You can also read about her in Eric McDuffie's really wonderful book about
Yes.
Black women in
And
Communist
Dr.
College.
Kelley, she's still alive.
Yes, I
She's
know.
she'll be 104 years old in August, and she's still alive.
Yes, I know she is. I know she is, which is amazing. Last time I saw her, she was 100 and just sharp, still. And this is someone who was not only like really significant leader in the Southern Negro Youth Congress, but went on to be like, an editor for Freedom Ways magazine,
Yes.
a writer, activist, and someone who, by the way, did write an amazing thesis on domestic
Yes.
workers
Yes.
in the Bronx slave market and domestic workers elsewhere. Just really classic Scott. I mean, she did everything, but she's amazing. And see, Esther Cooper Jackson is one of those names that we should all say as frequently as we say Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker. Although we don't say those names enough, but you know what I'm saying. I mean, she's that significant and that powerful, and it's just so generous as well. No question.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. And we're definitely going to be lifting her up from now on for sure. So next we're going to have some brief comments from our brother, longtime organizer, Brother Saladin Muhammad. Brother Saladin has an impressive history in organizing Black workers in the South. For example, he was one of the founders of UE Local 150, North Carolina's public sector workers union, as well as Black Workers for Justice, as well as the Southern Workers Assembly. The Southern Workers Assembly put out the initial call for actions in solidarity with Bessemer, Alabama, which started on February 20th. Saladin has been an organizer in the South for many, many decades. So, Brother Saladin, if you could speak to us about why it is so important that we organize the South and the significance of the Alabama Amazon Workers Campaign to form their right to a union. Brother Saladin.
And Comrade Saladin, just remember to unmute whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I was rolling. Yeah, thank you, Sister Asante.
Yes, sir, my pleasure.
I bring greetings from the Southern Workers Assembly. Really glad to hear Comrade Robin Kelley has his book and his practice has helped to open the eyes of many radicals about the role of the left in working to organize labor in the South. It's quite inspiring to see so many forces on the left rally to the call for solidarity with the Bessemer Amazon Workers Union campaign. It is hopefully attracting the attention of the major trade unions, and particularly the AFL-CIO, that passed a resolution in 2013 committing itself to organize the South. Rank and file workers and radicals should call for the AFL to revisit that resolution. I think it's important as a part of Brother Robin's important historical shaping to point out about the passage of right to work as a section of the Taft-Hartley Act. It was not only anti-labor, it supported the racist states' rights movement to reinforce segregation in the workplace. If you read about right to work, you'll find out how that took place. I think with Amazon, we have to look at it in a larger context. We have to recognize the economic shifts in the U.S. and globally that's taken place over the last 30 years or so. Some of the core industries of the South, of the U.S. national economy and parts of the global economy have relocated in the South. The South is one of the regions with the highest amount of foreign direct investment. So we have to really look at it as a strategic region, not only to organize labor, but to position the working class in the larger struggle for a radical transformation. The Bessemer campaign, like the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, can be an opening for labor in the Black liberation movement to build a more unified struggle in the South that was missing during the civil rights movement. It's really important to recognize the leadership of Black workers. You know, too often, the organization and leadership of Black workers have been wrongly characterized as narrow or narrow nationalists and therefore divisive to the working class. Here's an example of the leadership of Black workers that is prompted a massive solidarity movement of workers and supporters of all nationalities. And it's also leading a struggle that can unite white workers inside of the Bessemer plant and to bring to the labor movement, to bring to that campaign some demands about the impact of the low wages, of the underdevelopment of our communities, et cetera, that Bessemer and other major industries have in the South. A couple more points. I think, you know, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we have to see the Bessemer campaign as probably the first organized, conscious, and structural working class campaign since Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was an important movement, but one of its weaknesses is that it didn't penetrate those sections of the working class that was in a position to challenge capital and to challenge government, which is absolutely necessary in a strategy for radical change. The SWA sees using the momentum created by the Bessemer campaign as an opportunity to begin developing infrastructure that seeks to build workplace organizations, committees, small in the beginning, and workers' assemblies that can unify workers from different workplaces, as well as progressive forces, the left, as we're speaking about, so that we're positioned. We have to see that Bessemer is opening the floodgates for further organizing. However, there's got to be a lot of political work about this floodgate and about the potential that organized in the South has. The SWA will be organizing worker schools to involve workers, particularly in the South, that carried out solidarity actions in how to organize workers' assemblies and how to develop a plan to begin to help to build committees inside of the workplace. This is organizing in one workplace is very, very challenging for union campaigns all over the country, but it's especially challenging in the South. We have to build a movement, and this Bessemer campaign can't be measured solely by whether it wins the vote or not. It has prompted the beginnings of a movement, and we have to elevate that so that we're not disappointed if things don't go the way that we want. And let me close with this comment. Even when they win, this Amazon is going to do everything it possibly can not to bargain in good faith, and everything they possibly can to put roadblocks in the way from the union and the workers winning a first contract. So this solidarity movement, it will be needed in order to support that struggle. Again, thank you for allowing me to make a few comments and to be on with Dr. Kelley. I seen him. He was in the city where I live at. I live probably about five minutes from where Thelonious bunk. His house is at Rocky Mount. And so when he came to deal with Thelonious, I saw him and was able to walk home after that.
Wow.
Appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Comrade Saladin Muhammad. That was wonderful, and
Brilliant.
And what you're talking about too, the need, like there will be, another fight and another fight, and Amazon is not going to stop. And it's one of the reasons that we need this organization and this political education and the structure that you're talking about for workers' assemblies, particularly in organizing the South. It's really exciting to see these forces starting to come together. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I think we're going to be ending the event in 15 or 20 minutes. But I do want to make sure that we have time to take questions from the audience. And I know that we have on deck to ask a question. We're going to bring some audience members on camera and audio to ask their questions directly. So I believe we have Devin Cole from Pensacola, Florida, who's an organizer in the Central Gulf Coast region and is also an organizer with Strive. Devin, are you with us? Can you join us?
Yes. Hi.
Welcome, Devin.
Hey.
Hi, Devin.
Hello.
Hello.
First of all, I want to say, Dr. Kelley, what an honor it is. I am from Alabama. I'm a communist from Alabama. I live in Florida now, but I grew up in Birmingham, of all places, actually. I lived about 35, 40 minutes south of Bessemer growing up. So this is really personal for me to see, my hometown area leading this struggle. It's incredible. So my question is, we've talked about the International Day of Action Against Racism and union busting coming up on the 20th. And union busting is obviously a horrific tactic used by big corporations and bosses. But historically, it was also enforced in the South, as documented in Hammer and Hoe, as in many other accounts of Southern labor organizing, by the Klan and by the police. So obviously now in 2021, we don't have the Klan outside of the Amazon distribution center. We don't have the police and the Klan who often overlapped. Kidnapping lead organizers and taking them to the outskirts of town and running them out of town. But can you talk a little bit about why union busting is still such a problem, just as much of a problem today as it was 85 years ago, when it was enforced by the Klan and by the police?
Right. That's a great question. And I'm hoping that Saladin could also weigh in on this question, because it's a very important one. I mean, there's a couple of things to consider just in terms of union membership. Alabama is unique in that, compared to the rest of the country, the union membership is relatively higher than other parts of the country, which shocked a lot of people. It didn't shock me, but it shocked a lot of people. But the thing is, if you can win by consent, as Gramsci would say, then you don't necessarily need the Klan. And so if union membership is already low for lots of different reasons, which is a long list, and again, Saladin could explain some of those reasons, then the kinds of extra legal violence is not necessary as much. The other thing is that the structure of labor has changed so radically. I mean, it was always global, but it's extremely global now. It's extremely flexible. And corporations with support from the state has more tools to undermine labor. Saladin mentioned the Taft-Hartley Act, which was an extremely important piece of anti-labor legislation supported not just by conservatives, but by some liberal Democrats as well. We also went through a period where unions were seen as the enemy, as the problem. In the neoliberal era that we live in, unions are perceived to be, by even the so-called progressive media, not the really progressive media, but like MSNBC is somehow like a drain on resources. And that to have something like a closed shop would be a violation of liberty. The fact that all these so-called faux progressive institutions like Whole Foods can, when they start to unionize, they, they can get a friendly face, in support of their work. So I think in other words, the kind of extralegal violence isn't as necessary, but there's other kinds of violences that are going on. The violence of refusing to raise the minimum wage for decades, the violence of just immense poverty. And then just the fact that we get suckered into, given the pandemic, as an exacerbating situation, but suckered into supporting corporations because we think somehow they are the ones that are going to give us jobs. The whole, takers versus, job creators kind of thing. That discourse is still with us. So I think that's not to say that union busting isn't happening. It's happening all the time, but it's happening in ways that we sometimes participate in without actually realizing it. But what is true still, and even though the Klan does exist, but the Klan may not be out there doing what they used to do, but racism is still one of the Achilles heels that also helps the union busting process. But I would love to hear what my comrade has to say about this question, because it's a very important one.
Can you briefly repeat the question again?
Yes, so I had asked, union busting is still very much a problem today. And although you don't have, the Klan outside circling the Amazon distribution center and police officers kidnapping lead organizers and taking them out of Bessemer, could you explain why union busting is still detrimental to the process of union organizing?
Well, I think that that the employer tries to elevate the power that it has to stop the workers, from politicians to high-paid union busters, to breaking a law and only get smacked on the wrist. That old adage that we can't beat the system is still out there. And what makes Amazon so dangerous is that there's a perception that because of the poverty in the South, that the most exploited and oppressed workers and communities dare not try to do something as dangerous as to organize the union. This is very, very important to helping to shape what I would say a sharper working class consciousness for the Black liberation movement. And that's very, very, very important. Elder that was one of the founders of the Black Workers for Justice. His name is Abner Berry. Harry Haywood had came to Rocky Mount to meet with Abner. And he said, Abner, he said, I didn't know you was a nationalist. You found the Black Workers for Justice. He said, don't you think that this period, this was a while back, this was like in the 80s, don't you think this period is more like the 30s of Black, white, unite and fight? And Abner said that the 30s didn't have the 1960s, you know, where there was a Black liberation movement that forced concessions, you know, and racism has had many whites to think that the concessions that Black workers won, Black people won, were taken away from whites, you know. And he says, you know, this time the Black working class has to call for the multinational working class to unite, you know, because in the past, you know, the call for the multinational working class to unite did not come from Black workers, because it was characterized, you know, as some nationalist thing. This was the experience of the formation of the Black Workers for Justice. I'll say this last. I remember going to labor notes, and we have a cultural arm called the Fruit of Labor. And there was a white comrade who played guitar with the Fruit of Labor. And somebody from the left said, I thought y'all was the Black Workers for Justice. How you got some white boy, you know, playing a guitar, you know, in the Fruit of Labor? You know, I mean, it's like, you know, and so again, this question of the leadership of Black workers, I'm concerned that the AFL-CIO has not yet come out to fully endorse this campaign. And so not to do that, you know, contributes again to this view sometimes, you know, that, you know, the labor movement, you know, is not supportive, you know, of campaigns that are led by Black workers, and certainly not supportive of the Black liberation movement. So, you know, again, you know, study the Meade campaign in Atlanta in the 70s. They had the Klan, many Klan members worked there, and they came out on strike with everybody else, but they had a sign saying Klan for a good contract, you know, shop stewards for the Klan, you know, and if the white supremacists can infiltrate the police, you know, let's not think, you know, that they're not going to try to infiltrate with emotion, you know, of the working class, you know, begins to express itself. So, you know, we got to, Bessemer dared to petition during the period of the Trump administration, you know, who, you know, was making all kinds of threats, you see. And so again, whatever people's view about the Trump versus Biden, you know, there was a mass sentiment out there, you know, about, you know, the repressive and the fascist nature of the Trump administration. But these majority Black workers at Amazon took on a corporation in this climate. And so, you know, I think it's going to require more of that in order to beat back some of the fear that people have.
That's such an important point, comrade, and it does show too, like how scared the ruling class really does get when, you know, all the sectors of the working class unite and stop allowing themselves to be divided on lines of race and gender and everything else. Thanks, Devin, for that question. So we're going to take one more question tonight, as if it were possible. I didn't think it was possible for another heavy hitter tonight to be joining us. But next, we're going to hear from my dear comrade and friend, the novelist Susan Abulhawa, who is the author of Against the Loveless World, of Mornings in Jenin, a great Palestinian organizer and activist. Comrade Susan, are you here?
Hi, comrades. Yes, hi, Robin, Asantwa, and Saladin. It's great to see you all. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. I appreciate the points you made regarding international solidarity and the importance of that and the history of that. And on that, I'd like to just announce that the Palestine Postal Workers Union has endorsed the Amazon event, as well as the Palestinian Feminist Collective.
Yes.
So I feel really proud that Palestine has a presence in this. My question really is about the depictions of history and popular culture. It seems it's very clear to me that Black people have been at the forefront of every struggle that propelled social and moral advancements in this country. But it's really frustrating to me as a cultural worker to see, however, the ways that popular media depicts history ultimately. And we see this, especially through Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And as a Palestinian, I'm especially frustrated by Zionist narratives. But it's true also with, films that are made about labor struggles or whatever. It's typically white people become the heroes. Even, and until recently, even depictions of civil rights movements often glorified white allies rather than, the people who were actually dying on the front lines of these struggles. I wonder if you could just kind of speak to that. Speak to the, just the ways that these gatekeepers who shape popular imagination, the ways that they do that, and I don't know what outlook you have, what advice, what hope you might offer.
Oh, Susan, that's a great, hard question. It's hard because, like you, I don't have high expectations for Hollywood. And it's hard enough as an independent filmmaker to be able to tell some serious truths. I mean, there's some amazing films out there. I mean, classic films like The Killing Floor, for example, which really depicts the struggles of Black workers in Chicago. And, there's stuff like that. But you're right, Hollywood controls the narrative. And even the best efforts, fall radically short. And I don't know, and here we're in a period where there's more content, more people are watching TV, more movies being made, more technologies, more stories, just a deeper understanding of this history. But I don't really have a lot of hope that things will change. I do know that when it comes to the issue that you led off with, that is that every single revolutionary moment in the United States, and just talk about the United States, not just all of the Americas, but specifically the United States, began with, or was brought, the contradictions were brought to a head by Black struggles for justice and indigenous struggles, and we could see that, Reconstruction, we could see the so-called Second Reconstruction, all that. But what do you get? You get, the best we get are things like, I'm gonna say the best, but you take a film like Selma, which had a lot of potential, to tell a story of a movement. But what ends up happening is that the enemy is framed in ways that actually obscure the story. So instead of actually seeing the structure of racism, we see an evil individual in the form of Lyndon Johnson, who actually was far more friendly to the movement because he wanted Democrats to register voters, but instead Hollywood vilifies individuals. Even films I like, there's a tendency to kind of vilify the individual, to have good and evil, and you don't see structure. And it's not as if it's impossible. And I learned of course, you would know better than me, but some of the best examples, I think, of being able to see structure are some of the independent films coming out of Palestine, which is amazing. Filmmakers are able to tell stories where you see the apartheid structure in operation, and you see people navigating that without having to reduce people to kind of heroes and villains, But in America, it's never going to be that. Unless something changes. And I know it because my wife's an actor, and she gets scripts all the time, and they're so bad that you just want to cry, and even as more and more people of color move into Hollywood as writers, producers, directors, it hasn't radically shifted, because even those folks have trouble getting some funding and support for something that tells a very different story. But I'm just happy with one fact, and that is that movements make their stories. And as long as we pay attention to those movements and really pay attention to them and learn from them, these are the stories we have to pay attention to. And right now, the workers in Bessemer, the Amazon workers, are making a history that we need to pay attention to, as long as we know what's going on and not get caught up in the way the media creates a filter to frame the relationships for us.
Thanks.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you, Dr. Kelley. It brings to mind, I think it was Manu Sadia who wrote Trekonomics, talking about US popular culture, how it's not popular because it's not from the people, and it's not culture. As we approach the end of our program now, I do want to encourage everyone to check out supportamazonworkers.org, to sign up and get regular updates from the campaign. And you can also sign a petition to Amazon to demand that they end their union busting. You can learn about upcoming events and get in touch with organizers from across the country building this powerful solidarity movement. And again, if you have not already planned an action in your city, it is not too late to do so. But before we close, I would love to invite Saladin and Asantewaa and Dr. Kelley to make any closing remarks.
Well, first of all, let me say thanks to my comrades who joined us here this evening, Dr. Robert D.G. Kelley, Brother Saladin Muhammad, Ted Kelley, Scott Williams. It was a great pleasure to work with you all on this project. I think it was very successful. We had at peak about 400 people viewing and joining with us. So I think that's a great thing and shows a lot of great interest. I hope all of those people will be attending some sort of action this coming Saturday, March 20th, no matter where you live. If you don't have an Amazon or a Whole Foods in your community, you can go in front of your Chamber of Commerce. You can go in front of your city hall. There's lots of ways to do this. So I hope that people will be inspired by this discussion and others to do that. Sorry that we couldn't get to every question. Those who had their hands up, those who put questions and comments in the chat, but with more than 400 people joining with us, that's kind of a difficult thing to do. But we are very, very appreciative of the time people spent with this conversation. If Scott or somebody in our tech, I want to push Dr. Kelley's books. That's my shameless plug for you, Dr. Kelley. Hammer and Hoe, Race Rebels, Your Mama's Dysfunctional, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, Three Strikes, and the award-winning Thelonious Monk. And of course, Dr. Kelley has written other books, and he's also written articles. So please check those out when you get a chance. So I just want to say thanks to everyone. Thanks to the audience for your patience that we couldn't get to you. But we'll continue to organize and do more research on these issues and other related issues as well. So thank you all very much.
And thank you, Asantewaa, for coming up with this idea and for really pulling this together. It would not have happened if it weren't for Asantewaa.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Comrade Saladin, would you like to make any comments?
Well, I'm very glad to be a part of this discussion about the South, about Black workers, and about the importance of having the South and the Black working class within a perspective for radical change in this country. And so we have to push hard, not only to support the Bessemer campaign, but to elevate people's understanding about its meaning and the opportunities that it provides.
Beautifully and succinctly put. Thank you, comrade. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Kelley, take us home.
Sure. Well, besides just endorsing everything that Mr. Muhammad said, just two real quick things. One, I can't even express what an honor it is to be in this circle, especially with organizers and activists like yourself, like Asantewaa, like Saladin, because everything I know, I didn't learn from archives. I didn't learn in my graduate courses. I learned from elders. I learned from the organizing work and people who taught me and taught my comrades. And one of the things that I learned all along was that, that the world is our space of organizing, and any kind of transformative justice requires that we get outside of our boxes and build with other people. And it is true, Black workers have been at the forefront of so many of these struggles, and it's not narrow nationalists. And that, unless we can recognize the importance of economic justice, the importance of challenging capitalism, racial capitalism, then we're not going to go very far. The structure is not built for us, and we have to transform it. So I just want to tell people, just continue fighting, take leadership, not just from Black workers, but especially from elders who have been here and know the terrain, and just to be humble as we move forward.
That's such an important message to end on, because as important as it is to study history, we have people with us who have lived it, and what better way to learn is there? Thank you all so much, Asantewaa, Saladin, Dr. Kelley, and also Susan, Abulhawa, and Devin for their questions. It's been an honor to speak with you all. And for everyone out there listening, we look forward to seeing you in the streets on March 20th to keep building this powerful movement. Special thanks to all of our panelists for this incredible discussion, and to Saladin Muhammad in particular as well for joining us with Dr. Kelley. Organize the South, solidarity with Bessemer, free Mumia, free them all, and let's keep the fight going. And
thanks to our tech person. Thank you to the tech person.
Always.
Thank you so much for your patience.
We thank you, Scott and Nate.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Stay safe now.
Forward.
Okay.